All right. Welcome back to Testimony Tuesday here on the Taking the Land podcast. I am Pastor Adam Dragoon. Very glad to be with you all once again and want to welcome in a special guest with us today. We have Evangelist Leighton Ainsworth all the way from across the pond where it is balmy 1 p.m. where I am here on the East Coast. You are already looking like it's getting time for bed over there. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. How are you today, Pastor Leighton?
I am well, thank you. It's around 6 o'clock, so not quite bedtime.
Okay.
It's just dark
Well,
here.
that's it. So yeah, I think we met each other in a Holland conference way back when. Is that correct?
It was 2018, I think, February 2018.
Very nice. And I've followed a little bit of what God is doing in your life, and you've had quite a few ups and downs in the last few years. And so we're gonna hear all about that in the next coming minutes. So appreciate you joining us to share what all that God has done.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me.
So for those who don't know you, why don't you give yourself a quick introduction and a conference style intro and tell us the 3 to 5 minute version of what God's been doing lately.
Well, as you said, my name's Leighton Ainsworth. I got saved at the ripe old age of 16 outside of the fellowship, prayed with a friend of mine. I moved to London 2 years later and stepped into the Rotherhithe Church, which was then pastored by Pastor Paul Stevens. I would have been 18 at the time, and just basically started to serve God faithfully in that church. A year later, met my wife-to-be. We started to get to know each other around 93 and got married in 97, and then struggled a bit with the will of God, the call of God. I knew I really wanted to preach. I knew that the first time I street preached, that was what God wanted me to do. I think the struggle I had was, can I pioneer and pastor a church? And then lo and behold, God started to really deal with my heart in sort of 2007. And we were sent out in the November 2008 conference in Walthamstow to Bexley Heath, and we pioneered that church from 2009 to 2017, and really just felt the call of God to be an evangelist. So I spoke to my pastor a couple of times leading up to sort of 2017, and then finally Pastor Peter said, yeah, you know what, you can be an evangelist. So evangelizing from 2017 up till 2024. I was asked to take over a church in Sunderland, which is the north of England. It's about a 5-hour round trip there and back, so 10 hours in total. We were doing that every weekend for a year just to sort of help the church there. And then, yeah, just re-announced back out as an evangelist this year.
Praise God. That sounds like quite a roller coaster.
Indeed. You never quite know what's going to happen in ministry. But yeah, I really felt called to be an evangelist before I became a pastor. I think the struggle was the whole pastoring concept, and do I have the qualities or the personality, the character to pastor a church?
Well, that's unique. I don't know that I've heard that communicated exactly in that way before. Can you talk about what that meant to you, and how did God lead you in that direction?
So I think for me, it was preaching on the streets was my first exposure to evangelism. You know, we know in our fellowship, it's what we do pretty much every outreach. It's handing out leaflets, it's, you know, preaching, it's sharing your testimony. So getting saved in that atmosphere at the age of 18 and preaching on the street, I knew very, very early on, wow, I want to preach. But I think over the years, having been in the fellowship for as long as I have now, which I think is nearly 35 years, I'd seen a lot of people get sent out. It didn't work out. People come back for redirection. Some people leave the fellowship. So I think there was possibly some underlying fear that I wasn't really aware of at the time. And then just wrestling with your own inadequacies. You know, I didn't really leave school with a good education. So I didn't really I didn't really have a high opinion of myself, struggled with, you know, low self-esteem, such things like that. So I think when that call did come, it was like, oh, do I have the qualities? Am I able to even do this? And then obviously that fear factor of, well, if I do go out, you know, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if that happened to him happens to me? So yeah, by the grace of God, the Holy Spirit really did move on me in 2007. I knew it was God. And so it was just then wrestling about where God wanted us to be, really.
Wow. So, and so then how long were you evangelizing pastoring before you actually went out to evangelize?
About 8.5 years. So we opened the church in February 2009, and I was announced out in the October 2017 conference as an evangelist, and hence why you saw me in the 2018 Holland
There you go.
conference. It was just building relationships and connections and friendships. So yeah.
That's great. That's great. So there is another occasion to bring you onto the podcast today, and that is you are releasing a new book. So for those who don't know you, you are an author, and I think you mentioned this is your eighth book. Is that correct?
Yes, that is, yeah. 8
Okay.
books.
Well, we want to
Hard to believe.
we definitely want to do more of a deeper dive for our premium subscribers in the second half, but I do also want to give our audience the opportunity to get familiar with the book that's coming out. I believe it's January 30th. By the time this podcast release, it will already come out because this is going to come out in a few weeks' time. This is a book that is entitled Marriage Works, Building a Stronger Marriage. And I'm sure that anybody who is married can probably identify with the need for building a stronger marriage. Can you tell us what was your inspiration to write this book, and who are you hoping it's going to help?
Well, oh gosh, what was my inspiration? I was asked to preach a marriage seminar about 2 years ago, and it would have been my first one. I've done dating seminars and things like that, but never a marriage seminar. And I had inspiration for a sermon that I was gonna preach, and the Holy Spirit just led me in a completely different direction, and got really positive feedback about the sermon, the message, the seminars as a whole. Even leading up to that, a few people, had been asking me like, "Are you going to write a book on marriage? You've been married X amount of years, X amount of years." And I never really had the desire to want to do it, to be honest. I don't even know how I even got into writing because that's not me, if that makes sense. It's not who I am. It's not my education. certainly not my grades. So it's definitely the Holy Spirit. And so I think on the tail end of that, I just started to think, well, if I'm going to write a book on marriage, how do I want to approach it? And so I really got the idea of interviewing married couples, came up with a list of 4 questions that I wanted responding to. And I wanted both the wife's response and the husband's response. I didn't want the husband to be speaking on behalf of the wife. I wanted it to be that they provided their own individual responses to those 4 questions. And then that kind of helped shape the rest of the book, really, as I got those responses in, kind of gave me an idea as to what chapters to incorporate and involve.
Marriage, I think, is so integral to our churches and to what we do as a fellowship. Obviously, we do not send out single people to go pioneer or preach the gospel. And so this is like the foundation for any ministry that we want to do. It's true with anything else in life, is if we're going to make any progress or have any lasting accomplishments, it has to be built on a foundation. And I think that is so important for all of us who are in ministry and those who are going to hear this, that we cannot neglect the most important things, which is the foundation of our ministry. Can you talk about your own marriage and what it has meant to you to support your ministry through the years?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of what I've been able to do as a believer, as a Christian, has been because my wife has supported me. She has brought into my vision, brought into my ideas. She's never technically said no to anything in that sense of whenever it was led by the Spirit, God had already ministered to her and spoke to her. So, when I felt the call of God to be a pastor, 7, God was already moving upon my wife. So when I took her aside and said, "Look, I really feel God's pressing on my heart that we need to go somewhere," she was like, "Yeah, I feel the same." And then even just writing my books, I think she could see that there was a lot God was doing. I probably wasn't getting as many opportunities to preach because at that point I wasn't a pastor. I didn't have a church. I was just a young disciple in the church. So I think for me, writing became an outlet of just getting my thoughts and my ideas out there without the platform of being able to preach and share them. And it just grew. I mean, my first book started off as a sermon, and it just grew from there, getting different people's ideas and stuff like that. And so having my wife there to support that, to give me that time to be able to just focus on that and commit to that, it was really integral for, towards me doing what I've been able to do. And even evangelizing, 5 years into pioneering, I felt that call, that stirring, that God was saying, I want you to be an evangelist. And we'd already had that conversation about the call of God upon my life and stuff like that before we'd even got married. And so when I felt that stirring, she was like, okay, her perspective was, but God's doing stuff in the church is growing, we're seeing new people come out. But I think she could really see that God was dealing with me and ministering to me. So by the time it came, which was like 2 or 3 years later, she could see that was what God wanted. That was what God was calling me into. So I think having a person behind you, whether that's your husband or your wife, supporting you and getting behind you. And I think it starts with you being honest with what you feel God's call is for your life. And that obviously we know isn't a static thing. It can change throughout the duration of your marriage. You might not feel called before you get married and then get married and then feel called. You might feel called before you got married. And then, so having those conversations very early on to say, look, I don't feel called, but I'm open to it, or I don't feel called, I'm not, I just want to be a pillar in the church. Having those conversations before you even say I do, hopefully resolve some of the conflicts that come out in relationships later on.
So just reading the description that's here already up on the Amazon page for your book, it says building a stronger marriage will involve commitment, dedication, and determination. If you are willing to invest into your marriage, nothing in this world pays greater dividends. The sad truth is that approximately 25% of Christians end up divorcing. If going to church was enough to sustain your marriage, then why is this statistic so high? The foundation of your marriage is going to be built on the effort and the work that you put into it. Your marriage is going to reflect your investment into each other. The moment you stop working on your marriage will stop working. Can you tell our audience what is in this book that they are going to get out of it?
Hopefully the wisdom and advice of other couples, not just myself. The book was really shaped and formed by the feedback that I got to the 4 questions that I asked. I sat down and I really thought about those
Can
questions.
you recall what those 4 questions were?
So one of the questions was, what do you wish you knew before you got married? So was there anything that you wish you knew before you got married? If you've made any mistakes, how have you overcome them? How have you dealt with them? And what I think that the other question is, what's the greatest lessons that you've learned since being married? And then the last question is around just balancing marriage and ministry, and how's your approach towards that? Just getting that diverse group of people. So some people that had only been married a month, not a month, a year, sorry. Other couples that have been married 30 plus years. So I was able to get Pastor Stacey Dillard and his wife to feedback on some of the questions. Other people that had maybe got divorced and remarried, getting their opinions and advice. And some couples wanted to remain anonymous. And so, that was fine. I was willing to do that for them. And so, yeah, it was just, for me, like you said, it's that transparency, that honesty. I think, one of the things that I said when I was sending out the questions is I want transparency, I want honesty. And some of the responses have been really open and really honest and really transparent. And I think that's what's going to help couples, because I think what the struggle is out there is that some people don't have references. I was raised in a single parent household raised by my mother. So I didn't have that example directly. There were couples in my sort of family network that were married, but not directly. And so coming into the church and seeing couples that were married and having that testimony and example, but not just having that testimony and that example, but actually being conscious to build relationships with those individuals, to kind of learn from them and glean from them. So that, I think, is what's in the book, just those lessons of life that you learn just by doing life, going through challenges, difficulties, and how to process those.
Well, I think I need to read this book, so I am pre-ordering it right now for $9.99 on Amazon Prime. So
Well, thank you.
we'll include a link in the show notes if you're interested, and we'd love for you to get familiar with Pastor Leighton's work. Again, this is his 8th book, and we'll talk a little bit later about how you've written 8 books. That's quite an accomplishment. But I do want to learn a little bit more about you and your background. You mentioned a few things, and since this is called Testimony Tuesday, why don't you tell us about your background, how you grew up, how and where, and what did life look like for a small Leighton Ainsworth?
So I was raised in a small town in the southwest of England called Exmouth. It's the southwest of England. So you drive past Bristol and almost as far as Cornwall. So that was where I was born and raised. My dad was an alcoholic, so he was kicked out of the house probably around the time that I was 7. He had visiting rights to see us and stuff like that. I was raised with 2 younger sisters, so I'm the oldest. My mum did the best that she could with us in trying to raise us. And I think I got to that point in life where I was like, look, dad doesn't want to come and see us, because there'd be occasions where he would have scheduled time to come and visit and just wouldn't turn up. And then the next day would post a letter through the letterbox with no stamp on it, so you knew it was hand posted, apologizing about why he didn't turn up. And it was like, well, if you can make that effort, why couldn't you make the effort of coming out on the Saturday or whenever it was that you were supposed to see us? So from a very early age, I just had a lot of, for want of a better word, anger towards my dad. I think a lot of that was also about how it affected my 2 young sisters and watching them cry, witnessing them getting upset because he wasn't turning up. Educationally, again, I struggled. I think a lot of that was just disconnect. I just didn't connect with school, didn't connect with the education system, didn't leave school with good grades at all. And it was in school that my friend, whose name was Paul at the time, witnessed to me. Funnily enough, he wasn't witnessing to me. He was witnessing to a friend of mine called Wayne. And I went over and sort of interrupted their conversation, and he turned on me and started to witness to me. And I mean, it's hard to believe that as a 16-year-old, that was the first time I ever heard the gospel message, but it was. 16 years old, never heard about heaven, never heard about hell.
What about any religious background? Anything in your family? Nothing.
No. So I mean, there were 3 occasions while we went to church. You'd either died, got married, or were doing a dedication. We didn't go to church for any other reason. And with my dad being alcoholic, there wasn't any reason to go to church in a strange way. And I think some of that was also the fact that I think my mum didn't really have a belief anyway. So I'm not too sure whether I'd put her in the agnostic or not bracket, but she definitely didn't raise me with any religion. And so when Paul witnessed to me, it was the first time I heard the gospel. And it was a pretty much undiluted witness. If you don't give your life to Jesus, you're going to go to hell. And so I think I prayed initially out of that whole concept of it. I don't want to go to hell. Let me get saved and give my life to Jesus. But I didn't really understand.
So you were open to it, though.
I mean, that was the grace of God. I mean, seriously, I look back at that now and I conclude that salvation is a miracle, because it had nothing to do with me. I mean, I wasn't raised in a Christian home, didn't experience religion in any shape or form. So it really was just the grace of God that I was open to it, that I was responsive, that I even had that desire to even give my life to Christ. And so I started to go to church with him while I was in Devon. I did that for about 2 years, but again, didn't really understand the decision that I'd made. Some of it was made out of fear. I don't want to go to hell. And so, I was sitting in church and I was still sinning. I was still doing the things that I would normally do as a sinner, but just now going to church. And so
you don't count that as a conversion experience?
I mean, I definitely had a experience. I just don't think I was in the right environment. And 35 years later, we still have no church where I'm from.
Really?
No church. The nearest church is a 2.5-hour drive.
Wow.
In an area called Bristol. And so, I was just living in sin, made a couple of really bad decisions. And in between that time, I was coming up to London because my uncle, to cut a long story short, had got saved in Perth. And instead of coming back to Devon to live, he moved to London because Pastor Paul Stevens had been announced out to start the church in South London. So I think my uncle might have been coming 1 or 2 years after the church opened. So the church opened in, I think it was 85 or 87. And he might have been coming a couple of years later. And so I would come up to London in my school break on my half term, and I'd visit him to visit London. But because he was going to church, I got dragged to church because I was living in their house, I was staying with them. And so that was my second experience with God. And I think that was when he really made himself real to me. And I think it was also linked to the fact that I prayed that as well. I remember just sitting in church going like, if I'm going to do this, I have to do this right. And I want you, Lord, to make yourself real to me. And, God did. As an 18-year-old, God just met with me in a very personal way. I remember just giving my life to Christ, praying, and, not looked back. Been in the church since 92.
So, Pastor Paul Stevens, tell us about the ministry that you got saved under and your connection to him, since he's familiar to most people who are going to hear this.
Indeed. I mean, he had such a desire and a hunger to see God do something in London. And, throughout his struggles, and obviously as you get older, you begin to reflect and you're like, yeah, there was those years of struggle and financial hardship and difficulty. None of us had jobs, or if we did, we weren't really well paid in that sense. That I was 18. Pastor Peter, who would have been a disciple in the church, probably would have been a few years older. Pastor Joe Gunya, again, a few years older. So you had these 18 to sort of 25-year-olds, and you're trying to build your church with that, with maybe one or two married couples in the church. And it was a challenge, but I think you could see, just that desire to want to see God do something, his commitment to work with us. Out of all of the men that really got saved under his ministry that stayed, only one of us at this present time isn't pastoring. All of us became pastors. So Pastor Joe Gunya, Pastor Peter Agila, Pastor Jay Nemard, myself, we were all discipled by him, and we were all impacted by his life. So just seeing that play out and just seeing how many of those men that he discipled are still serving God, they're still married, they're still in right relationship with God, is a testament to his leadership and also a testament to his example. One of the greatest privileges I had was to share the stage with him last year in conference. Friday morning, I preached, Jay Nemard preached, and then Pastor Paul Stevens preached. And I remember the in the morning before we were going up onto the stage, I remember turning to Pastor Jay and saying, do you know how surreal this is? That both of us were discipled by this man, and we're now standing on the stage, preaching on the same stage as him in conference. It was hard enough not to be filled with fear because you're preaching at conference, but to share the same stage with Pastor Paul Stevens was an emotional occasion. And I owe him everything, to be honest. Just his investment in my life, his willingness to discipline and correct as well. He didn't take that lightly.
Yeah, and he's such a unique guy too. He's got a unique voice, I think, within our fellowship. And just observing him, and I've gotten a chance to share a few meals with him over the years. He's got, if you don't know him personally, he's got kind of a mean looking edge to him. Once you get up close and personal, he's such a helpful, thoughtful person. And can you tell us a little bit about the church that you came into at that time, and what was God doing there? What was the revival? What was the atmosphere?
Well, you had your core that was there. So that would have been some of the people that I mentioned, my uncle and his wife, who I was staying with at the time when I moved to London. And there were a number of other people. And it was probably maybe 25, 30 people max, including Pastor Paul Stevens, Renee, Joe Stevens, Jenny and Kerry. And it was just literally outreaching. We used to outreach in an area called East Street Market. So at one point we had church just there in East Street Market, and we would go out on East Street Market, would go Elephant and Castle, would outreach there. And it was just literally just one by one, seeing people get saved, seeing people getting added to the church, working with them, discipling. And then from there, Pastor Paul Stevens left to take over the church in El Paso, and Pastor Carnegie came in to take over. And I think that was quite a shift in terms of what we began to see God do, because he was able to build on that foundation that Pastor Paul Stevens had left, core men and women that had been established under Pastor Paul Stevens' ministry, which were almost like the foundation of the church. And then just building off of that, we really did see revival with Pastor Carnegie. We started to just see traction we would start seeing 100, 150, 200, 300 people coming out to church. And then shortly after he left was Pastor Peter Aguilar. And that's where we saw the explosion in church planting. So I think under Pastor Carnegie, it was more just the establishing of the church, the congregation, the 200, 300s. And then with Pastor Peter, it was that vision of let's launch out couples, let's send out couples. So I was actually sent out by Pastor Peter Aguilar.
That's amazing. And I'm sure it's got to be amazing for you to be a part of that growth from the beginning, to see all that God did. And there's always, of course, there's always heartbreak, people who, you think of that are supposed to be there, but they're not, but also those that have been faithful over the long term. Can you talk a little bit about just watching the church grow from its foundational stages, and to see, over the years what it has meant to you as it's grown?
But I think first and foremost, it's humbling. It's humbling because you get to witness it. When I pioneered Bexley Heath, it was myself, my wife, and my kids. And any pastor that's pioneered a church before understands what that feels like. So on reflection, having that experience made me appreciate even more the labors of Pastor Paul Stevenson and his wife, Renee, with a small church of 30, 35 people where, he was struggling sometimes financially. He came to church once, the building was shut. The guy that was supposed to come and open the building didn't turn up, and Pastor Paul Stevens wasn't that kind of guy to quit. He wasn't that kind of guy that would turn around and say, okay, guys, we're not going to have church today. He was like, what can we do? And we weren't far from a McDonald's. There was a McDonald's on Walworth Road. And I remember he just walked into the McDonald's, spoke to the manager. The manager said, look, you can have that little section over there. And that's fine. And so we went over and he did church. He did praise and worship. He did an offering and he preached. And so I think for a lot of us guys that
Did you get fries with that?
No, I don't think we did, but the manager was kind enough to allow us to use it. And so that instilled on a lot of guys this no quit mentality. So when we went out and we had those services where we were struggling and I was questioning God, is this what you want me to do? I just went back to that service in McDonald's. And I was like, well, even if I'm preaching to chairs, at least the chairs are still coming back out to church. That was my mindset. It was like, I'm not going to quit. I'm not going to give up on this. And that was because that was what was instilled in us. And so when Pastor Carnegie came in and we just saw that numerical growth, it wasn't like it was one revival or one concert or one impact team. It just progressively happened where you would turn around in a service and, wow, okay, when did that happen? And so, it was just amazing to watch that. And then to become a conference. So I believe actually it was myself and Pastor Prazin who went to Bristol. We were both announced out in 2008. And that was what made Rotherhithe a conference body. So the following year, we had 3 conferences. We had 2 conferences with Walthamstow and our conference. And just to see that and witness that was just like, wow, and even a Walthamstow conference just last year, I had the opportunity to go. And I remember sending a message to Pastor Brown saying, like, this is humbling because they had to hire out a marquee. I think the marquee sat about 1,700 people. And just to remember the first ever Walthamstow conference was in 1993. And to have been there and to have seen that, to now witness this, it's humbling.
That's so cool. So we're for those who don't know, my family and I, we're moving back to Chandler. We're just on the precipice now of relocating our lives. And the Chandler Church this year is having its 50-year anniversary. I my story with the Chandler Church began in 1998, and so that's not it's I guess it would be close to half of that time, but you have a similar experience to see the difference between what God was doing back then versus now. And you're right, it's humbling to be part of something greater and realize that it's thousands of little decisions of sacrifice and people making responding to challenges that God puts in front of them, and over again, it's those little things that add up to make a big difference. That's pretty amazing. So, did your wife come in? Like, when did she come into the church?
So she was there just a little bit before I came in. So when I came in, it would have been like officially 1992, but I was on and off between 1990 and 92. So she probably would have been around at that point, sort of 91. So her whole family got saved. So herself, her brother, her cousin, her mum. So at one point they were all, the whole family was in church. And so when I came in 92, she had kind of just started to get serious and started to really live for God. So I remember just in the early years of just focusing on my relationship with God, because when I got saved, for me, it was like, I just want to focus on God, because I'd had that 2-year experience of just being wishy-washy, on and off, not really serving, God, sinning in church and stuff like that. So when I recommitted my life to Christ, it was like all or nothing. So I wasn't even thinking about relationships. So I do remember we went on a couple of impact teams together. I very quickly became an usher. That's the wonderful thing about being in a small church. You get ministries when you shouldn't get them. But no. So I became an usher. So I was watching her, but again, it was just like, didn't really think about dating or relationships. And then, to be honest with you, I thought this person was way out of my league. So I was like, there's no way, even if I did like her, that she would say yes. So it would have been like a whole year later where I picked up the courage to sort of ask her. And I did it in the most squeamish way possible. I just said, look, would you like to get to know me first? And to my surprise, she said yes.
How romantic.
Yeah, basically. It's like, I'm not sure you want to say yes until you get to know me.
Yeah. And how long did you say you were dating before you got married?
Too long, I think. We did have a little bit of a split in between that time, but we got married in 97.
Mm-hmm. And how old were you guys at the time?
So I was 22, turning 23. She would have been 21, turning 22.
Okay. And was there other married couples at the time in the church, or you were one of the
Yeah,
early
no,
ones?
quite a few. So Pastor Jay would and his wife Cheryl, Pastor Joe Stevens and his wife Julie. So there were other couples that had got married before us who are still married today. Probably one of my references have been Pastor Jay and his wife Cheryl, obviously Pastor Paul Stevens until he went to El Paso, and then other couples that I've been able to get to know as I've preached around and been an evangelist. I've built relationships with other married couples, and I just try and remain connected in that sense.
So thinking back to your experience as maybe early on as a Christian, and then the discipleship journey, what did those early years like? If you could name maybe a top 3 list of the issues that really God had to work out of you, or things that God had to shape you in those early years.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, stubbornness, I was very stubborn. Pastor Jay will testify to that. He would say jump and I would say why. And how high do you want me to jump? And when do you want me to jump? And where do you want me to jump? There was just a streak of stubbornness in me. But I would say my saving grace was being able to take correction. In one of my other books, Be One, Make One, where I talk about discipleship, one of the chapters is about dealing with correction correctly. And it's this whole concept of some people, they get disciplined and they kind of get on their high horse. Why are you disciplining me? Who do you think you are disciplining me? And it's like, well, hold on, wait there. Let's just think about this for a minute. What you did deserve punishment. So did you do something that deserved punishment? And if so, why can't you just receive it? Like, if you've gone out and you've sinned and that's not what you should be doing, then there needs to be correction brought. And so, as a disciple, I was corrected on a number of occasions and put out of ministry a couple of occasions. And, I never viewed it as a slight against me. It was that time of reflection, coming back into that ministry and having a greater respect for that ministry, a greater appreciation for that ministry, understanding that ministry doesn't exist for us, it exists to serve people. And in fact, if people weren't in church, there would be no need for ministry. So, so I think, And then outside of that, I think it's just really praying and just saying, God, where do you want me? There's always a place to serve. It might not be the platform, it might not be on the stage, it might not be in praise and worship, but there's always something you can do, whether it's just taking that time to encourage somebody, edify somebody. So, when I came back as an evangelist, one of the first things I said was, which guys can I work with? Which guys can I spend time with? And I really made an intentional point of spending time with guys outside of church. So going out for a coffee, going out for a Starbucks or a Costa, or spending time at McDonald's, just really having conversations. How are you? Where's things at? What are you struggling with? What do you need help with? Just building those relationships. There isn't around another church program, or because it's Sunday, let's meet up, or because it's Wednesday, let's meet up. No, let's just meet up and let's just chat. And so just doing that, but I think, I had to work that out. There was stuff that Pastor Stevens had to deal with. There was stuff that Pastor Carnegie had to deal with. And there was stuff that Pastor Peter had to deal with. And so, even, Pastor Ruby, there's times where he's had to take me aside and speak to me and have conversations. And so you never get to a point where it's like, oh, I'm perfect. There's still going to be areas that need to be challenged and worked on. When we were asked to take over the Sunderland church, I was in pastor's office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday until I said yes. So
does that have anything to do with that stubbornness streak you mentioned before?
And the 5-hour round trip there and back. So 10 hours every weekend. No, but I think, the wonderful thing about headship is that headship is there for a reason. Leadership is there for a reason. And you've got to appreciate that your pastor doesn't just have a vision for the church. He has a vision for your life. And whenever he's doing anything, it's because he has a vision, whether it's to bring something out that's inside of you, a gifting, a talent, an ability, or whether it's just to challenge you to say, hey, listen, what are you doing? You need to fix up. And so understanding that, leadership is there for that reason kind of helps you appreciate that they're not just there to govern you and to dictate and that's not the kind of leadership that they're doing. It's more just to draw out that calling that God has placed upon your life. I didn't know what God called me to when I was 18 years old. I was still trying to work out life. Like, I've left school with no education. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? But Pastor Paul Stevens saw something in me and was willing to give me responsibility, was willing to give me a position of ministry. And that was because he saw something in me that I didn't necessarily see in myself.
Yeah. That's I think that's the calling of what servant leadership is supposed to be. And obviously there are always bad examples that we can point to of people who have abused their positions of authority. But, when it's working like it's supposed to, we're supposed to be what Jesus spoke about, which is the greatest among you will become servant of all. And that true service, it's not always the service that we feel like we need. I mean, what I mean to say is that the way that our leaders serve us is by showing us sometimes things that we can't see in ourselves. And that's to reveal those blind spots that we all have. And that's really important that we maintain that openness and that connection with our headship. Not, it's not always based on, how intelligent somebody is or how much experience somebody has. It's just that it's that God ordained relationship between someone in authority and someone under authority, and there's blessing on that. And that's what Jesus talked about with the centurion who said, I'm a man under authority and I know how to give commands. And Jesus marveled at that, and he said this, he equates that to I've not seen such great faith in all of Israel, that revelation of knowing authority. And so to anyone who struggled, and the reason I'm, I guess, talking about this a little bit is because I can identify with that and questioning of authority, and not always thinking that there's the best intentions at heart, but learning the lesson over time is that pastors are there for a reason, pastors, and it's good, and it'll work out for the better if you wouldn't work against them, but work with them, So that's so powerful. I wonder, having my own experience with growing up in a home where my dad was absent, I think that I've struggled a little bit with that, just because that not that my dad was a bad guy, but he just wasn't around, and so I didn't know I didn't receive that fatherly correction. It was a new thing for me when I came into the kingdom,
Mm.
and I didn't initially take to it very well. I've learned over the years how to do that, and actually to be grateful for it now. But do you think that that played into maybe your perspective on headship and authority?
Definitely. I think, my father just didn't know how to have a relationship with us. I think some of that was born out of his own childhood trauma. So he just never connected with us. So, as I said before, like he would have visiting rights to come and see us, and he would just not show up. And, I think for me, that hatred, that bitterness kind of grew. So, you get saved, and the first thing God dealt with was that. Honestly, I mean, I remember it was a revival. I couldn't even tell you who was preaching, but he gave this excellent example. And I left going like, I need to forgive my dad. I need to get right with him. And I remember that the next opportunity that I had when I drove down to see my mum, I said, right, I'm going to make a point of going and visiting my dad. And I did. I got to witness to him. I got to tell him that I'd given my life to Christ and stuff like that. And I got to verbally say to him, I forgive you. And there's that forgiveness doesn't always lead to reconciliation. Sometimes we don't want to forgive because we don't want to reconcile. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't lead there. Our relationship never reconciled. And that wasn't out of a want of me trying. I tried. He just didn't want that relationship. He didn't have that capacity. So when I got saved and I came into the church, having a male figure over me was challenging because it was the first time I'd had anybody in my life that was a male figure or that was an authority figure kind of say no, or no, this is what you should be doing, or no, this is how you should be doing it, or no, you're not doing it correctly. And so I think, I had to then begin to sort of view it as, well, look, my pastor's not my father, but he is my headship, he is my leadership, and I've got to give myself to that authority. I've got to submit to that authority. And I've tried to do that in the best capacity I can. And I've grown and I've learned over the years how wise it is just to give yourself to leadership and submit yourself under authority, because that's been a blessing to me and my family. And it's helped me to become the man and the husband that I am, and also the father that I am, having these men in my life and having the privilege of having such great men such as Pastor Stevens, Pastor Carnegie, and Pastor Peter Angela. I don't take that lightly. And even Pastor Ruby now, like, I could have never imagined that Pastor Fred Ruby was my pastor. But having him now, he's been my pastor now for 7 years. I've just grown so much under his ministry and his leadership and his headship because of how he approaches it.
That's amazing. So I want to maybe this might be a good time to take a break and say goodbye to our free listeners. I want to ask you about some lessons that you took away from the pioneering experience. I want to ask you about the transition that you had in your life going into evangelism and how that's been for you. I know that you also, being basically a caretaker for the last year or so with this the church, I'm sure you took away some powerful lessons there as well. But we're going to save all of that for our premium audience. And I want to take a moment to ask them to consider joining up and becoming a premium subscriber. You can do that by following the show notes in the links, or following the links in the show notes below. And when you do that, we, just so you know, we do not keep a dime of that. We pay for our software and operating expenses. And after that, everything goes to world evangelism. So it's a good win-win situation. And you also will get ad-free versions and full-length Testimony Tuesdays of all the episodes in the Taking the Land podcast. So please consider that. But before we take a break, very quickly, maybe Pastor Leighton, maybe what you could do is it possible? It's always possible. Somebody is listening to this who doesn't know Christ or has not been serving him, has been wandering, maybe prodigal situation. I wonder if you could take a moment to just remind us of the good news of the gospel and how somebody could turn to him in the time of need.
Yeah, I mean, looking back at my life as a 16-year-old, I was empty. There was something in my life that was missing. And I tried to fill that void with so many things, as people do. They turn to drink, they turn to parties, they turn to, relationship. And the reality is that just becomes a cycle that you keep going back to because it never satisfies. It never calms that raging emptiness that's inside of you. And what we've got to understand and realize is that that void is God. It's having a relationship with the Creator, the one who made us. And that's more than just religion. That's more than just going to church. That's more than just following a list of do's and don'ts. It's personally knowing the God who made you. And once you have that relationship, once you have that connection with him, you begin to understand what your purpose is. So many people walk around this earth with just no purpose, no vision, even though they might have a plan of what they want to do with their lives, or they might have a couple of things that they say, yeah, this is what I want to achieve. There's still this level of, I don't feel like I'm fulfilling my purpose, because ultimately our purpose is to know God, to have a relationship with him. And so if that is you, and you are in that place where you're seeking, you're empty, you're trying to fill that void, I would really encourage you to just simply pray and say, God, number one, I'm a sinner. Forgive me. You know, Bible's very clear. We've all sinned, all fallen short of the glory of God. So confessing our sin and acknowledging our sin. And then secondly, just asking him to come into your life and to be your Lord and Savior. And once you've made that decision, trying to connect with a church locally, wherever that might be, and just trying to serve God. I think your relationship with God is going to be based not just what you do in church, but what you do outside of church. So connecting with God, reading your Bible, praying, and things like that. So that's what I would encourage you to do. And even maybe message, if this is a function that you have, message and just say, hey, listen, I've prayed this prayer, and then we can connect with you and reach out to you.
For sure. Yeah. Any comment you leave wherever you're watching or listening to this, we will definitely see that. Also included in the show notes is going to be a link to our fellowship map website where you can see if there's a fellowship church close to where you are. So I would encourage you once again to go check out all of the information we have in the description. For now, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to hit up our second half and talk a little bit more about Pastor Leighton's ministry experience. And also I want to ask him a few more questions about the book that is coming out January 1st, Marriage Works, and get some wisdom and insight. I could probably use it. So for our free audience, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. We appreciate you coming along for the ride. We hope that you'll consider becoming a premium subscriber. But for now, we're going to take a break and we'll come back for our premium audience in just a few moments.